to watch men murder each other like animals!
Shadow of Rome released in 2005 for the PS2. 2005 sure did see a lot of ancient Greek and Roman settings, didn't it? Wait, I think I said that last time. I likely won't be talking about God of War on this channel, so this is it. The final in this quasi-series I found myself reviewing. I must say, although Colosseum and Spartan Total Warrior were more consistent in their quality and pacing, Shadow of Rome has higher highs than either of them. The moment I realized I could German suplex enemies into a death pit, oh my god, euphoria. However, the game gets a little worse as it goes on, and near the end, the difficulty ramps up to an almost absurd level. The other half of the game, the stealth sections, also lose their luster before they're all done with, and even though it feels like they were included to improve the pacing, when nearing the finish line, they start to hurt it. All that said, this game is still mostly awesome as all hell, and I could easily recommend it if only for the first 3/4 of the game. The lows of Shadow of Rome are a bit easier to deal with given how much fun the game is at its core. Eventually the player will settle into a predictable back and forth, a half hour as Octavianus sneaking around guards and exploring sectioned off bits of Rome, and a half hour to an hour as Agrippa slicing off arms and heads in gladiatorial battles. At the start this transition exists as well, but it's more tutorialized and focused on exposition. After an introduction to the base mechanics in a future supposed first gladiator fight as Agrippa, we're sent a few days into the past. Julius Caesar and the recent history of Rome was explained in the opening Attract video, as was his assassination, which featured a very familiar line.
Et tu, Brute.
Octavianus, nephew of Julius Caesar, was orphaned as a young boy, mostly raised by Julius himself, and is, of course, devastated by the news. Most of Rome is, actually, given how beloved Julius was. Antonius is named as the successor, as Julius's will supposedly appointed him as the best fit for the job, and Vipsanius, Agrippa's father, is accused as the killer. Octavianus manages to sneak in and overhears the Senate's plans. Gladiatorial games are to be held, a way of mourning and celebrating Caesar's life, the winner of which being given the honor of executing Vipsanius. Antonius then says he's fine with the Senate's decision to execute Agrippa's mother, Vipsania. Meanwhile, Agrippa, a soldier who very early in his career was given the rank of centurion by Caesar himself, is leading the war efforts near Rome's border. After more tutorials and a boss fight, Agrippa returns to Rome after hearing about the assassination, and Octavianus, his dear friend, confirms the death of Caesar, and gives him the news that his father has been accused as the murderer, and right now his mother is set to be executed, for some reason. Agrippa almost manages to rescue his mom, but Decius, the bastard, throws a sword at her back and finishes the deed. Agrippa and Decius have a small skirmish, which Decius gets the upper hand in, and afterwards a mysterious woman we'll eventually know as Claudia makes the rescue. Afterwards, Octavianus and Agrippa sneak into the jail where Vipsanius is being held, and the only clue they have to go on is the final words of Julius.
Et tu, Brute?
Yes. Those were Caesar's last words.
After they escape the jail, they regroup on the outside and come up with a plan. Agrippa will compete in the gladiatorial games, and Octavianus will continue to search for the real killer in Rome. Claudia's brother Sextus is a showman for the games, which is how Agrippa will be able to participate, and the reason he'd want to compete being that, because the winner will be the executioner of Vipsanius, it'll give him a chance to rescue his dad. Plus, Decius is apparently the final opponent in the games, the man who murdered his mother, meaning revenge is also on his mind. That's the basic premise, and most of the major players involved with the story. I left out a few names here and there, some of which I'll touch on later in the story section, but I think that's enough for the start of the video. It's at this point when the game really starts to open up and show its true colors. Although the gladiator combat is really fun and the highlight of the game, the boring tutorial section is worth talking about, if only since it demonstrates how this game could have been so much worse than it is. In gladiator bouts, roughly 90% of all combat in the game, you're scored based on the salvos that you earn mid-battle. These pop up like little achievements when you do a specific thing, and range from 50 points to 1000. Some can be as simple as landing a few hits in a row, wearing certain types of gear at once, or landing the final blow on an enemy with your bare hands, killing an enemy with a thrown weapon, toppling multiple foes over, performing a ton of German suplexes, using an opponent as a shield and protecting yourself against enemy attacks, setting warriors on fire, utilizing specific traps, and so many more. There are diminishing returns though, so doing the same thing over and over won't keep netting you the same number of points. There are quite a lot of salvos that are for specific battles, like boss fights and chariot races, but even without those, the amount of them in the game is seriously impressive. The points awarded are a representation of how entertained the crowd is, which makes sense, and is even handled better than in Colosseum in my opinion, since in some battles you need a certain score to not fail, and the crowd you're entertaining repays the favor by tossing in strong weapons mid-battle. The scoring system, working both for the thematic purpose of bloodthirsty Romans wanting a good show, and the gameplay purpose of giving the player better weapons for putting on said good show, is the best of both worlds. The amount of traps to utilize, in addition to the arenas and goal of each bout being that little bit different, does wonders for the variety and pacing, as in an individual sense, nothing really overstays its welcome. I too love the death pits, the rotating blades, the Crushinator 3000s, the oil barrel torch combo. I enjoyed the team battles where you bring an ally along to break the enemy statues, the 1v1 who can kill the most enemies contests, the free-for-all extravaganzas, the usual elimination matches, and even the escort missions. The extra enemies funneling in sometimes got annoying depending on the specific battle, but for the most part it felt fine, as it meant you got to stretch your legs a bit in those open areas when you first got going. It practically became a few different fights in the same big battle, and the contrast in weapons, enemy types, and sizes meant it didn't feel strictly like a repeat of the previous wave. It was different enough to keep it engaging, at least for the most part. However, all those positives being said, the times where you play as Agrippa and are not in the arena feel fairly clunky and lifeless. The salvo scoring system being absent doesn't really give reason to do anything fun or out of the ordinary, just be as efficient as possible. That wouldn't be horrible, but it's pretty clear that this combat system just isn't up to scratch when traversing linear areas. As much as you can work around it in the arena battles, the lack of a roll or another quick lateral movement option such as a sidestep mapped to a button press makes targeting enemies and approaching them kind of a hassle, especially if they have spears and you're in an enclosed area. When raising your guard up, either with a shield or the weapon you're holding, you can't move at all. I understand that spacing is a big part of any melee combat system, and being able to slowly approach with a shield raised could be overpowered in this instance, but your speed while locked on isn't nearly as responsive as I'd like. You can either be sluggish or jerky, and in both, the inconsistencies of the controls means you might do one when you wanted to do the other. Sidestepping or jumping back with a hard press of the directional input is definitely supposed to be the answer for avoiding many attacks, but I often found myself breaking the lock-on and running around at his jog speed, since I couldn't be sure of whether the enemy's attack would close in on me too fast for either of the supposed dodge maneuvers to properly create the space I wanted. In arena fights, again, this isn't that annoying. Since you're given plenty of space, you can mostly wait for enemies to approach you, and naturally you're able to utilize the many traps and environmental assets available. In the tutorial and endgame levels, you basically don't get any of that. The early areas especially are extremely boring and flat. This genuinely does make the gladiatorial combat arenas look better by comparison, by a wide margin, but starting the game off by making you sneak around and wail on goober enemies in a gloomy forest setting is rough. The controls and weapon breaking system might take a bit to come to terms with, and making the player go through linear environments right away, well, at least after the flash-forward first gladiatorial game, could be really off-putting. It was for me, and if I hadn't pushed through until this section here, where the salvos get introduced properly and some of the fun nuances of the combat get explained more in detail, I may have decided to opt out of doing a video on Shadow of Rome. Genuinely, if the game was mostly in line with the beginning forest stage and jail escape sequence, I would have been pretty bummed. The tutorial sections with Octavianus didn't suffer from the same issue. You learn to crouch, hide in pots, knock out guards and bystanders, take their clothes or items, walk to blend in, answer questions to avoid suspicion, and so on, in a natural, albeit mostly linear, fashion. There was only one part in the intro bits that felt odd, which was where you had to hide a rope behind your back and approach the guard blocking the forbidden evidence room to choke him out. If you try to walk in while wearing guard armor, he just stares at you for a while, then performs murder the moment you cross the imaginary line. Overall, the stealth sections were pretty hit or miss. At their best, they basically play like a non-lethal version of Hitman, offering multiple routes, allowing players a choice in how they progress through a semi-open environment. There's a mission where you'll need to enter the tavern, but both entrances are inaccessible. One has bees buzzing around, and the other a no-nonsense bouncer. There's a banana peel in this level, the first you'll come across, and you can use it in one of two ways. Throw it at the guy trying to deliver honey at the back door, and he may drop the honey, which distracts the bees away from you. He might slip and fall, too, which is pretty funny. The other way is even better, just throw the thing at the bouncer guy, he gets mad and runs towards you, only to comically wipe out and leave the front door unattended. There are a few other notable times where you have options on how to proceed, but none stuck out as much as that one. I think, even when there aren't multiple paths forward, the inclusion of those standout levels makes the mostly straightforward puzzly ones that much better. There's always a possibility of there being a few ways to go about it, which makes you seriously consider every puzzle piece you come across. For example, just the very inclusion of jars, honey pots, ropes, or other items that can take down hostiles means taking their clothes is always something you could do. Sometimes it helps, and then other times it's not the way to go. Items such as apples could be used like a stone for distraction, but in a few instances you get to be more creative. Throw an apple at a guard and he'll go attack the guy who he sees holding the apple. Throw it at the horse and it'll mow down the guards in the area, granting you access to the door they were in front of. Mind you, these are the correct solutions to the puzzle the game presents the player, but because it isn't as rudimentary as throw stone to distract enemy, or crouch behind low cover to avoid detection, it makes you see the world a little differently. There are plenty of those aforementioned moments as well, but the fact that those aren't the status quo just shows you that the designers of Shadow of Rome were trying to spice up these stealth sections to make them on par with the fun you'll have with the combat when playing as Agrippa. Did they always succeed? No, but that might mostly come down to how much they nailed the gladiator half of the game. There are some problems with its execution, which I've touched on a bit before, and will touch on again later, but overall though, fuck man, playing around with this combat system is seriously enjoyable. You can hold certain weapons in the X slot, and certain ones in the square slot. X is main, square is secondary. Main weapons consist of swords such as the gladius and scimitar, and blunt weapons such as the mace and morningstar. Sub-weapons range from a dagger to a torch, a bow, sling, and many types of shields. There are also plenty of two-handed hefty boys which take up both buttons, thus granting an extra attack animation essentially. The main weapons all have their own distinct swings and combos, some good for cutting off limbs and others good for breaking bones. The sight of a wiggly-armed warrior slowly approaching never gets old, and it has real benefits as well, such as them not being able to pick up weapons in that hand. Slicing off limbs is demonstrably advantageous, but in addition to them being unarmed, you can grab their lost appendage and use it as a weapon too. It doesn't do much damage, but sure enough, it's a salvo, and you can toss it into the crowd for another distinct salvo. There's also a salvo for when your enemy loses control of their bladder, which I apparently did trigger at least a couple times, but it seems to only be possible in the early levels, and it's hard to really tell when it's happening. Either way, it is kind of funny. Anyway, with the main weapons, along with their unique combo chain, you can perform a supra attack, which is done by pressing up and attack at the same time, as well as a charge-up attack, which is obviously a much stronger variation if you have the time and space to get it off. The many sub-weapons all do wildly different things. The dagger is extremely quick and works very well when used in tandem with a sword, as you can stun-lock combo opposing gladiators until one of your weapons eventually breaks. The torch doesn't do a whole lot on its own, but when paired with oil from certain barrels, it can light enemies on fire. The bow and the sling are ranged weapons by default, the bow being pretty easy to utilize since you can fire at a decent rate, and the sling being slower and harder to connect with. The shields are good for protection, of course, but you can also bash an enemy with them too, which can come in handy depending on the situation. The two-handed weapons get the supra attack, which is usually some stabby variation, or in the case of the halberd, an uppercut thing, and they get a square and X button swing. With the halberd, you can press square enough times to start spinning with it, and it also has the best charge-up attack in the game, providing Agrippa super armor, meaning he can't be interrupted in the middle of a charge-up, and it flings enemies into walls and each other. Incredible. The greatsword is fantastic with its horizontal slashing and high-angled downward strike. The maul basically ignores defensive stances with its basic overhead attack, and the spear is, in my humble opinion, the cheapest and most overpowered weapon in the game. Thrust attacks from other big weapons leave you with a good window to punish the enemy, but the spear just pokes in and resets basically immediately. There's no downside to that initial stab, there's barely any starting frames to the animation itself, and once you land one hit, the stun lock kicks in, allowing for multiple jabs and a flourish. It's simply too good, and that's evident when on both sides of the equation. I've abused it in crucial boss encounters, and have been on the receiving end, which mostly only serves to frustrate. Beyond those, you can also come across a flail which acts as a main weapon, and one of its animations is a persistent rally towel-esque motion. After a few hits, it seems to bring the action to a standstill. The other gladiators just wait until you're done. It has a very deceiving thrust attack. Its range is very long, so you can get hit when you might not expect it, and hit others when you thought you'd miss. Something kind of funny, if the crowd throws in a flaming variation for you to use, it just might set you on fire. What a toss, guys, thanks. The big rocks you can use to throw at enemies, or place in catapults on levels that have them and fire away. All of the main and two-handed weapons you can throw, either by targeting the foe or using the first-person view. Taking out a perched archer with a spear throw is one of the best feelings. Your aim isn't the best when the enemy is on the move, however, which is also how it goes when the situation is reversed. Watch this idiot, absolute moron, throw his only weapon, miss entirely, then have nothing to say or do as I obliterate him with my currently equipped sword. Then, once I'm done with him, I take the spear he threw at me. What a terrible strategy, dude. Even when just listing out the weapon selection, it's already easy to see how much variety is possible with the combat, but there's so much more. The enemies come in 4 main flavors: regular, little, big, and female. Oh, I guess there's also the animals, such as elephants, tigers, and birds. Ignore those though, the human varieties are what matters for now. The regular guys are self-explanatory, but the others have some uniqueness to them. The little dudes are an absolute nightmare, probably the only enemy type that makes me think differently when I have a halberd. They can roll away so quickly, dart around, jump off walls, do backflips. They're rough, especially when combined with other enemy types. It was frankly perfection to pair them with the rotating blades. They can't be hit by them, but you can, so they'll dance around and try to bait you in. These big fellers have a larger attack radius on most of their swings and punches, and have super armor sometimes, meaning they don't get stun locked as easily. Even though you might find them sprinting now and then, they're usually on the slower side. However, if you're focused on taking out quicker, higher priority targets, such as flaily boys, little guys, or female warriors, they might ruin your day even still. The female warriors seem to come equipped with bows more often than the other types, which already makes them more of a hassle, but their unarmed form is dangerous too, as they chain together a flurry of kicks. There aren't many exclusions when it comes to what enemies can hold. The only thing I think is off limits are big two-handed weapons for little guys and female warriors, and bows for the big dudes and little guys. I could be wrong, and perhaps in my editing I'll find more or correct myself if one of the exclusions turned out to be false. Even still, 4 enemy types mixed with a dozen unique weapons, and then add in the many gimmicked arenas? This is why it's sometimes easy to view the stealth sections as Octavianus as a detriment to the pacing, since the gladiator games never get stale since they offer so much variety. This gets taken even further with the chariot races, but we aren't there quite yet. Now that we have the enemies and weapons talked about, we can get into the real meat of the nuances at play. This is what really pushes the game over the edge for me, and some of it has to do with a few of the salvos I already mentioned. The many unorthodox ways of dealing damage, which usually net you a unique salvo and add to your score, are a joy to explore. The grab that leads into the German suplex move gave me a series of separate discoveries about the game, and with every new breakthrough my excitement levels grew. First it was seeing the suplex in the first place, then learning you could bounce enemies off walls, then that you could fling them into other enemies, learning how to bait out this groggy state semi-consistently, and finally, throwing guys off ledges and into death pits. The knowledge that you can hold on to enemies and use them as a shield was also revelatory. What a fantastic little detail to add into the game. The groggy states exist with all enemy types, and there are a few ways for it to trigger. Sometimes after enough blunt attacks, it seems to happen on its own. If an enemy has taken enough damage and has the slouch position when standing, you can walk around them and instantly get the grab to work. And best of all, when an enemy is knocked down for longer than a second, you can pick them up with the square button and they'll stand up in a dizzy state. All of this, especially the picking up enemies and grappling them, really reminds me of some of the best wrestling games on the N64 and GameCube. The childlike wonder of testing out some of this stuff was almost nostalgic. However, I do wish there was a bit more here. As much as I love reenacting the birth of Suplex City, some other moves for when you're on the side of the opponent or in front would have been cool, and maybe something else to do from the back so you don't necessarily need to end a beatdown session with a suplex. Maybe a bulldog of some kind on the side, front could be a belly-to-belly, when they're on the ground you could do a big swing or catapult them into a wall or other enemies. I don't know, after a while I was kind of disappointed there wasn't more to discover. Perhaps that's me being greedy, and I should be happy with the possibilities on offer here as is. The other attacks, while unarmed, are mostly just punching, but you can also hold X and do a shoulder ram, which makes enemies drop their weapons. Pressing back on the control stick and an attack button, either X or square, will result in a kick, but I never thought that came in handy much, besides when kicking an elephant for a unique salvo. If an enemy is downed, you can stab them with your weapon if you're locked on, but if you aren't locked on, you stomp them with your foot. Kind of a neat distinction, I suppose. If you get knocked down, much like the other warriors, you can get up quickly or use quicksand to stun nearby gladiators. This affects your teammates too, so watch out. I don't hate this, but one thing I noticed is how the game, in this one particular instance, cheats in favor of the enemies. You can perform a stab maneuver when an enemy is down like I just showed you, but you kinda have to get close to them, putting yourself at risk of quicksand, and then do it. When you're on the ground, you're able to wait there a bit in hopes of enemies coming closer for a quicksand to pay off, but they also tend to warp over and stab immediately, not giving you enough time to catch them. They slide over, basically skipping the space where you'd want them for the quicksand to be effective. Usually they stand outside of your reach, so you have to wait for them to come over anyway, but then they just come over and stab you. It's kind of lame. Along with throwing them off ledges, you can knock enemies off of ladders too. Some gladiators should have definitely put more points into their intelligence, as they just keep on trying to climb up only to get cheap-shotted by yours truly. Agrippa isn't safe on ladders either though, but at least I'm smart enough to cut my losses and try something else. The weapons having a durability meter and breaking so quickly was genuinely a huge pain in the ass when I first started playing, and initially I was ready to criticize it up and down, relating my frustrations to what others must have felt when they talked down about Breath of the Wild's weapon degradation system. However, that frustration essentially completely evaporated once I saw how much the game benefited from it. You can taunt and potentially get more weapons that way, steal one from an enemy using a couple of different methods, and even when unarmed, you still have your bare fists and the groggy state suplexes to work with. The weapons start to resemble toys for you to play around with, which definitely makes the game feel more fun and exciting, but it also invites a more methodical and tactical approach to every individual combat encounter. You're forced to utilize what you have and think about what you'll use next. It keeps you on your toes, encourages you to familiarize yourself with many different weapons and gameplay mechanics, and it overall just keeps the game from feeling too samey. So many of these types of action games cater to the simple hack-and-slash mindset, but Shadow of Rome seems almost unwilling to cave in to that potentially mindless approach. You're going to have to think on your feet and switch things up, thanks both to the salvo scoring system and the weapons not being infinite sources of damage. Among the many other quasi-hidden mechanics, you can press X at the right time to roll around an enemy, you can press X at the right time when unarmed to snatch an enemy's weapon from them, and you can approach an enemy unarmed and play tug-of-war essentially, mashing square and X to steal their weapon. I think all of this is great since it gives you more avenues to express yourself in combat, especially when you're without a weapon, but I must say, everything being mostly the same buttons makes all of this feel fairly unresponsive. The Rolling Thunder maneuver never, ever felt consistent for me, and the fact that it's simply the main attack button all but guarantees you'll mistime it and swing instead, or do it by accident when not even trying to pull it off. The snatch move works in a similar way. After a while it did feel a bit more consistent, but because it's such a high-risk move, it's not something you're likely to whip out in the middle of difficult and, at times, overwhelming battles with large groups of enemies. What all this boils down to is that many tools in your defensive moveset are either high-risk gambles or are tied to buttons on the controller which do other things. Going back to my point from earlier, the game can outright feel unresponsive at times, and the shield locking you in place just means you'll have to test the waters with some of these moves instead sometimes, which more often than not, don't go the way you were hoping. Mapping so many actions onto a single button is already a bad idea on paper, especially for an action game with punishing fail states later on. However, in practice, it's so much worse in this instance, as the X button is simply overloaded. Unarmed, it's a punch, it's a charge ram, it's a snatch, and a tug of war maybe? Armed, it's a swing, it's a charge attack, a roll dodge, or a stomp or a stab, the latter being something that he would do when I absolutely wouldn't want him to anymore, since he stabs even as they're standing up for some reason. Add on to this, pressing up and X will do a super attack. If the snatch and roll move were their own dedicated input, such as one of the shoulder buttons, and if it was paired with an animation that always played out, leaving you open for attack if you mistimed it, I think would make it far clearer than what we have now. It's not so much that the timing window and punishment for failure is the problem, it's how easy it is to perform actions you don't want your character to be doing. Later on, in the final boss fight, super attacks become fucking vital to pull off, as well as sidestepping his attacks at the right time, and so often I'd perform a normal attack or not move the way I wanted to. I'm not showing the final boss footage right now, by the way, as I don't want to spoil it for anyone who chooses to duck out when I get to the story section. Octavianus also has a few techniques that share the same button, but they basically aren't a concern at all given how much slower his gameplay is on the whole. Along with a refreshingly open approach to what would normally be a baby's first stealth section in other games, the times where you do need to hide, crouch, and take cover thankfully aren't as one-to-one paint by numbers as it could have been. For example, here I'm taking cover behind this pillar, which is a set contextual action, but the guard's vision doesn't care about that. If his eyes land on me, he knows I'm there. Similarly, if a guard wakes up someone you've knocked out, he knows what happened. He'll run around looking for you. However, there are quite a few stumbles when it comes to the intelligence and limitations of the guard AI. The red meter that determines if you've been spotted slowly goes down when you're out of eyesight, but Shadow of Rome falls into the issue a lot of these types of games have, where their aggressiveness or pathing don't change much, if at all, even though they know an intruder is in the area. I know the MGS titles are dedicated stealth games, and were made by an incredible visionary team, but it was certainly nice that they made the game a little harder for a while when you were spotted and managed to escape. The map in Shadow of Rome is genuinely way too helpful, but I won't dwell on that for now. Here you can see precisely when the guards stopped chasing me, just before they would have seen me hiding, and returned to their previous posts. It seems rather ridiculous that they wouldn't at least go as far as to check the room they saw you walk into. Similarly, if you escape capture, then pop out while in the previous disguise they saw you in before, and were, at the very least, suspicious of, they're fine with you again. If you run to the load screen door when they're chasing you, you're home free, which is pretty silly all things considered. I'm not sure how they could have gotten around that in a way that didn't feel restrictive, but it certainly trivializes some encounters near the ends of the levels. You can also, in many situations, take advantage of them chasing you. Since they're so tunnel visioned during detection periods, you can sometimes run right by them or in front of them and chill out in a different area. Wild. The guards are, of course, magnetized to the sounds of many of your throwables, such as pens, darts, apples, and rocks, much like many modern games, which is obviously a tired and kind of boring gameplay solution at this point. You can whistle, which works in a similar fashion, and I think that feels a lot better. Some guards are locked to a certain position, though, such as the one earlier I spoke of, that you had to approach with a rope and choke him out. Whistling will make him say,
What was that noise?
But he'll never come find you. The option to wake a downed guard or citizen never seemed to be beneficial outside of one or two specific circumstances, and the same can be said for dragging downed enemies as well. Hiding items behind your back is a fun idea, but it is a little absurd to imagine that they would rush to murder a would-be Senate member when they spot them holding a jug or a pot or something. Running around also raises their suspicions, so it's best to walk and blend in. Not quite as cool as it was in Assassin's Creed, but that game came out a few years later, so it isn't fair to compare. Something that initially impressed me was the questioning mechanic. Basically, when you're disguised, walking about, casually trying to sneak by in plain sight, you might be stopped by a hostile, either a guard or a bandit or what have you, and be questioned. The constant heartbeat thumping, in addition to the abruptness of their call-out, makes these moments genuinely nerve-wracking.
Excuse me, sir?
And when this first triggers in the early stages of the game, it has all the ingredients to imply that your answer to his question is vital to not being caught. If you answer correctly, his suspicions won't rise, but if you answer incorrectly, they will. This is great! You can already crouch and press circle near doors to peek through the keyholes, which in this instance gave you some dialogue which may have helped you remember the right answer. Seriously awesome! However, when digging deeper, you'll realize that this is all a facade. Sometimes every answer you could give arouses suspicion, meaning there wasn't anything you could do to weasel your way out of his interrogation. Even more, a guard being suspicious or not doesn't do anything. They just stare at you for a bit, but nothing else happens. They don't have a behind-the-scenes suspicion meter or anything, at least I'd assume not, since they all behave the same way all the time, so really, your answer is always pointless. The cherry on top is that you don't even have to stop when they call out. You can keep walking with zero repercussions. They'll always say, "Guess it was my imagination," or some form of that. It's so sad. This could have been a really fun mechanic if done right. There's a lot of fun background stories happening, and every NPC has unique dialogue to them. Even when you come back to them in the future, they'll have something new to say, which usually fits in line with what most recently happened in your investigation. This occurs with Agrippa's training hub area sections as well. Everyone has their own lines, and they grow and expand on themselves after each return visit. It's great. Imagining having to do some reconnaissance as Octavianus before the mission starts, learning what's going on that day in town, and maybe using that to slip by any guard that questions you, sounds like a perfect gameplay purpose for the, as of now, optional NPC dialogue. As much as I am criticizing this, I have to imagine what I just described, or something better at the very least, was their initial plan, but something went wrong and they had to ship it out with a less than fleshed out interrogation system. I don't have any proof or anything, but it would be so bizarre if this truly was what they envisioned. As much as I love the banana peel, since it's self-evidently hilarious to use, it feels wildly overpowered. I know I throw that term around a lot on this channel, but know that in this case, I don't mean it in a negative way, it's just really good. In the bandit mission, I took all 4 of them out by simply moving my character in front of the peel when they all heard my whistle. Absolutely amazing. I don't think its GOAT status hurts the game by any means, since it does feel like the designers knew it was too good as well, and only provided it for a few specific levels. Other fun, items, I guess, include the rats and the frogs. When thrown near civilians, they'll freak out and run away, which could potentially get them in a better position for you to be sneaky. Again, this goes back to my point from earlier. Maybe they'll be in a level to help you out, or they'll just be there because. The introduction to these guys is quite smart. It isn't a tutorial by any means. The city gates location that you're able to explore on your own eventually houses frogs, and a lot of them. This is where I figured out their effect on the citizens, since I wanted to see why they even appeared as items on the map. Green dots indicate something you can grab, and besides items for stealthing, silver coins get scattered around for you to collect as well. In the optional city gates area, there are loads of merchants that sell you things, which end up in your room in the starting area of town each new mission. Some of it is stuff you can practice with in your secluded little room, such as throwing apples at a dartboard, but others can range from decorative to even painful. Yes, slipping on a banana peel can deal damage, but what's more, if you buy the tiger for 100 money and you throw stuff at him, yeah, he might kill you. Depending on how many things you buy, you'll also access some different hairstyles. I think his default is the way to go, but something about how the onion head clips through walls and pops up over cover when hiding is pretty funny to me. One more slightly humorous detail is that you can't take the maid's outfit off the maid herself. Octavianus won't undress her. This game was rated M, so I'm sure they could have gotten away with it, albeit maybe with some backlash. This was 2005, remember, but maybe they just decided to prevent you from doing it to match Octavianus' character? Either way, not a big deal, and the map usually has the maid outfit on it if there is one in the area. As I said though, the map seems way too useful. There's almost no reason to take cover and peer around the corner, since you can pull your map up and see exactly where they go and which direction they're looking. The map can also come in handy with Agrippa, specifically to see if there are any loose weapons lying on the battlefield, but since the combat section of the game is far quicker, you'll have less room or reason to rely on it. The only time it makes literally no sense to use it is with the chariot races. The chariot racing kind of comes out of nowhere right in the middle of the game, and I don't mean to imply that's a negative. Even if Octavianus and his stealth segments were removed entirely, I feel like the pacing would still feel pretty good, considering after every X amount of arena bouts there's a new setting which features a new color scheme and unique hazards, and right in the middle there's an extended chariot race section, which obviously plays very differently from the usual fights. The racing mechanics aren't anything spectacular or anything, but they aren't bad either. You can speed up by telling the horse to go faster, and they have a stamina bar of sorts at the top left which runs out. You can attack enemies by riding up beside their carts and wailing away. Not as much depth here, you can block attacks and swing your weapon. After a lap or two, a slave will walk into the middle of the track and offer a better weapon, which you can grab by angling your cart in the right spot. You could also decide to run them over instead, both of which are their own salvo, naturally. This is, surprisingly, the only time in the game you'll come across a whip. It's touted as the best chariot weapon since it has the most range and does a lot of damage. If you press R1 or L1, you can also slide your cart over to the left or right. This means you can ram other carts into walls, potentially leading to the destruction of their chariots, and seeing the enemy lose a wheel and slow to a crawl is a pretty funny visual. This can also happen to you though, so if you're reckless and join the fray haphazardly, you'll notice your wheels get more and more wobbly. You fail if one of them falls off, just like you fail if you don't come in first place in the race. I've only won one time by beating the last man standing to the finish line. It's usually much better to murder everyone before the final lap. Octavianus also sees a sort of gameplay switch up near the middle, right about when the chariot races take place. This is the only time in the game you'll have to tail someone. There's even a tail gauge specific to this one mission. I feel like the timing and placement of this unique stealth gimmick had to have been purposeful to put both characters up against something they haven't seen before at the same time. That said, I think the chariot races are handled far better, as this tailing sequence is pretty rough. It's essentially the worst of what these stealth sections have to offer. There's little to no freedom to try anything, it's just trial and error until you do the right thing. On a first go, you simply won't have any idea what paths any wandering NPCs will take, and you don't have time to observe them, as if Mecanus is out of sight for too long, you'll fail and have to start from the last checkpoint. For example, here in this hallway, if you don't already know there's a wandering man about to walk out of this door and approach you head on, you won't know to cross to the other wall beforehand. What initially presents itself to be a fairly innocuous either-or of waiting on this side versus making the pass to the other, one of them is the right answer, which means you'll do it randomly and it'll pay off, or you'll fail and keep it in mind for next time. Even though you didn't need one before, you need to grab a disguise that's on the floor in the corner immediately after a cutscene is finished, since in a few moments a guard will come down the hall and spot you if you didn't. This is an example of me choosing the right option by accident the first time through, as I used the video gamey logic of, this is interactable, therefore I need it approach, a thought process I've already demonstrated before that the best of these stealth sections mostly do away with. Another immediately after cutscene bit happens earlier on, where the moment you gain control of Octavianus, you have to run into the side room to avoid detection from a wandering NPC. If she spots you, you'll have to wait out both the guard and her slow movement speed before attempting to catch up to Mecanus, which just isn't possible. This trial and error stuff just isn't all that fun for me personally. The best I can say is that when you don't run into any issues and correctly guess what might happen up ahead, the tail gauge is easy to manage, and him turning around to see what's behind him is always accompanied by an audio cue first, which is a very forgiving warning for the player. I wouldn't mind more of this mechanic in other parts of the game, But then again, if this is the peak of what they could pull off with it, maybe it's best that it only serves to spice things up in the middle. The ending to this sequence is also kind of unrewarding, as Mechanus just openly catches you in a cutscene, and Octavianus just stands there. It kind of clashes, you having to avoid detection this whole time, otherwise you fail, to then have the game say, "Ah, here's where Octavianus was meant to be detected." I don't know, it's not awful, but it's not great. Besides the two thugs who you burn with torches near the end, this is the most boss-esque encounter for Octavianus. A far cry from the amount Agrippa gets, but his side of the game is more focused on combat, where boss fights fit in much better, so this makes sense. Even though Shadow of Rome's combat is at its most engaging with multiple foes, the boss battles surprised me with how decent they were. They mostly serve as a finale for whatever arena setting you're in, which works well in ending each area with a flourish. I'll hold off on the end bosses for now, but there are plenty others to talk about. The first real boss is a really clever encounter, both with gameplay and narrative. Barca is the tutorial boss you fought in the forest introduction section of the game, and after you defeated him, he begged to be killed, but Agrippa kept him alive. He's found his way into these gladiatorial games, and has gone undefeated just like you have to this point. I said earlier that there are a lot of salvos that are unique to certain situations, and one here was really fun to discover on my own. I noticed when I threw a rock at him, he'd catch it and throw it back. This was early on in the game, mind you, so I hadn't yet learned to respect how good this game is at letting the player experiment and try interesting things. I figured it wouldn't work, but I said screw it, let's try to steal his weapon while he's holding the rock I threw at him. Sure enough, it worked perfectly, and the game awarded me with a specific salvo, assuring me that the game knew it was a possibility, and was, in a way, encouraging me to try it. After you defeat Barca for what is the second time, there's no pacifist route for Agrippa this go-around, the crowd demands blood. This is where we get the great gladiator speech that I hopefully played at the beginning of the video. The second boss is the first of the Valcross clan will face, Arcanas. She comes equipped with a fire bow, and her gimmick is she's a bird lady and will jump from pillar to pillar. If you're a sneaky boy like me and know how effective the grab strat is, you can steal her bow and shoot her down that way, dealing damage. She then brings in birds though, which kind of ruins that strategy entirely. The catapults in the area are for destroying the pillars she uses, not for hitting her, as she'll always jump out of the way if you aim it towards her. Claudia joins your efforts for this fight, for some reason, so even though this is a step up in difficulty compared to the previous boss, Claudia helping out makes it a little easier to come to grips with. The third boss, Narcolesti, is a... I don't know if I'm saying that right. The third boss, Narclasticity, is another of the Valcross, but this time it's a chariot battle. This is definitely hard, but it's not terribly different from the other chariot races. Getting a whip is essential to take out his multiple health bars, and it was fairly tricky to approach him often enough to deal damage, but also avoid him slapping your wheels off. He doesn't appear to have any unique salvos, sadly, it's all the same stuff for the chariot encounters. The next boss is the final Valcross boy, Ascari. He rides an armored elephant, and you'll need to attack its limbs enough to remove the armor, deal damage to kill it, then face Ascari himself. The halberd is definitely the way to go here, as its charge attack sends him flying, but if your spacing is wrong, he has a tendency to stun lock you with his crazy combos. This was one of the stages that had food in it at the start behind a few of the barricades, which was very much appreciated. The healing system in this game is really fun. You chomp on some food, either meat, cheese, or bread, to gain your health back. Mashing square will make Agrippa chew faster, which is helpful, as you can't stop the eating process once it starts, you're completely vulnerable. When you talk to the guy who lets you compete, he asks you what you'll want to bring in with you, and you get a few options. It's usually a melee weapon and a shield combo, but after a while you'll see some advanced variations, two-handed types, bows and slings, and even food. You could always go in with nothing, but that's usually a bad idea. It sometimes went in my favor, such as when trying to steal a big weapon right away and leaving the enemy with nothing, but yeah, usually a sword combo is best. Later in the game, however, you might find yourself choosing the food option just to have a healing item when you need it. You can appeal to the crowd and they might throw you some cheese or something, but their generosity has its limits, and if you haven't entertained them enough for how often you've been asking for things, they'll leave you hanging. They might toss you a rose, but those are worthless beyond getting some salvo points. It is a nice touch though, and throwing them in the crowd along with weapons gets you points as well. Something that caught me by surprise and added to the game's difficulty was the fact that the enemy warriors can steal the weapon or food you received from the crowd, getting the audience worked up enough so they graciously provide a greatsword, only for an absolute dickhead to come by and swipe it off the ground is heartbreaking. My only lifeline, my one chance of survival, stolen right in front of my eyes. I didn't see them stealing meat, cheese, or bread quite as often, but it has happened, and when they began chomping away on my food, I turned into Jackie Gleason from The Honeymooners. Well, not quite, I didn't beat my wife, I took it out on the gladiators.
Now, get my stuff!
The food takes the spot of the sub-weapon, and it's the only item you'll drop when you take damage. It's pretty irritating to constantly lose hold of your meat. Wait. No, yeah, that's what I meant. I don't have too much to say about the visuals and sound, but I really liked how this one specific hallway looked in the basement of the training area. The torches made it look so comfy. I kinda wish there were more times where they tried stuff with this soft lighting. The character models and their voice acting looked and sounded mostly fine, but Claudia's mouth was so strange to me. She is friendly the whole way through, but her smirk made me think she was going to betray me, like the entire game. Agrippa's voiceover is sometimes pretty flat.
What? Are you remembering something?
But Octavianus is good. It's the voice actor who played Robin in Teen Titans.
That indicates that there was more than one murderer, including a certain Brutus, who Caesar would never have expected to turn his back on him.
The music that plays in the background is mostly fine, but one transitional song got stuck in my head for a week or so, and if I have to live with it, so do you. I'm fine with it being something I hum or whistle now and then, it's quite soothing. When it comes to the story, the main strength of Shadow of Rome's many cutscenes and NPC dialogue boxes come from how they weave the separate storylines together, flesh out the world, and build up certain characters for later on. Since this game isn't talked about too much, and I just overall enjoyed the narrative quite a bit, I'm going to indulge and go a little more in-depth with the story than I originally planned. Spoiler warning, but also, if you're just not interested in hearing about the plot, themes, and characters a whole lot, skip to here. You will be missing out on some boss fight discussions, as well as some other stuff, but like I said, I get not being interested in these types of plot synopsis analyses. If you couldn't tell by now, this is a fictionalized retelling of Julius Caesar's assassination. I have no idea how close this is to reality, but I'd imagine it's pretty far off. If I'm wrong, let me know. After Caesar's cremation, Octavianus gains help from Pansa, one of Julius Caesar's former agents, on where and how to start looking for clues. When meeting Vipsanius in jail, Octavianus learns of Caesar's final words, "Et tu, Brute." The only Brutus Pansa is aware of is Marcus Brutus, Cicero's protege. Cicero was the Senate speaker who accused Vipsanius after Caesar's cremation, and read the document to anoint Antonius as his successor. We follow Cicero to get to the person named Marcus, who we then track down in the taverns. We find him getting upset and storming off, which leads to an altercation with his friend Cassius. Cassius tells him there are many in the Senate who believe Vipsanius is innocent, eventually shouting at Marcus that he must take responsibility. After we follow them through more back alleys and bandit-infested slums, Octavianus finds Cassius with a knife in his chest, dead. We see Macanus, Antonius' secretary, and the one to suggest the gladiatorial tournament in the first place, walk into frame and order the guards to dispose of the body and to never tell anyone what they saw here. He certainly looks and behaves in an evil fashion, and Octavianus is similarly confused. Octavianus' next objective is to find Macanus and question him. On our way to Antonius' estate, the game prompts us with a big expository paragraph. It's a little window into the past, detailing how Antonius selfishly assumed control of Pompeius' residence after the latter had passed in the Battle of Pharsis, and even though Pompeius was Caesar's sworn enemy, upon return, Caesar fought for justice and demanded the property be returned to the descendants of Pompeius. Basically, Julius Caesar good, Antonius bad. While on the hunt for Macanus, Octavianus overhears Antonius and Decius discussing matters relating to Agrippa and his side of things. Of course, Octavianus isn't privy to what's going on with Agrippa and the gladiatorial half of the game, but because the player is, all of this makes sense. This peek into what Decius, Agrippa's main antagonist to this point, is thinking and doing would work either way, but having us learn of it thanks to decisions made by the other player character make it all the better. However, because both characters' missions and events happen simultaneously, and we go back and forth repeatedly after every little story beat or character development, this particular cutscene loses out on some of the potential this framing offered. I know it would be a nightmare for gameplay, but imagining a version of this game where you see all of Octavianus' story, then you see Agrippa's afterwards, only to culminate at the end, would make this moment even more fun. You'd hear about events that you would experience yourself later on. At the very least, we do learn of the chariot races before we partake in them ourselves, which is good enough, I suppose.
Very well. I shall send a herald to Macanus.
Thank you, sir.
While we tail Macanus, we overhear some conversations, most of which paint him as an accomplice, or at the very least, a loyal henchman of Antonius. In a truly bizarre moment, Octavianus does this after you spent the last 20 minutes sneaking around to not get caught.
Macanus! Antonius calls for you!
What a beautiful voice you have, Octavianus. It was almost convincing.
How did you know it was me?
I thought it was you.
Macanus says he didn't hide Marcus's body, he doesn't know what Octavianus is talking about. But also, Rome is already in a state of turmoil, and Cassius's death would affect the gladiatorial games negatively. He then tells Octavianus not to pry any further, that he'll regret it if he does. Sure seems like Macanus is a bad guy, but at least he lets you leave unharmed. Before the next mission gets underway, you can read the notice board outside of your room, which lists the accomplices of the criminal Vipsanius, two of which being Marcus Brutus and his friend whom we saw stabbed to death, Cassius. Talking around town reveals that Vipsanius' supposed co-conspirators are all being executed, and some random citizens that aren't involved in any way are getting caught in the crossfire due to having a similar name. The Senate is on lockdown, with rumors running rampant about nefarious behind-closed-door deals and other goings-on. They're trying to purge everyone associated with Antonius apparently, and Cicero, the one we're hoping to question in this mission, has been placed under house arrest in the Senate offices. While we're in there, we overhear some guards talking about Agrippa, saying they used to respect the general, but after him becoming obsessed with being a gladiator, even participating in the chariot races, they don't anymore, and so on. Neat stuff. When we finally find Cicero, he too apparently fell victim to a soon-to-be fatal stab wound. He says Vipsanius didn't kill Caesar. Marcus Brutus didn't either, but he was part of the congregation that did. Cicero says there's a second Brutus, and to go to the shrine. We discover Marcus kneeling above what appears to be many Senate members' dead bodies, referring to a nebulous you. He says they created the congregation only to destroy it one by one with no respect. Octavianus lays out his theories of a shadowy group of men, not one person, carrying out the assassination. That the other Brutus, the man behind it, is now systematically eliminating all who know the truth, including Cassius and Cicero, the latter being Marcus's mentor, only offering Vipsanius' name to protect his protege. Octavianus is mostly on the money, but Marcus is having none of it and runs off. Macanus walks in, all evil-like, and doesn't seem all that surprised to see these Senate member dead bodies lying about. Octavianus recklessly, in my opinion, rushes to him and tries to explain that it isn't Vipsanius who killed Caesar, it was the congregation of assassins. Macanus demands proof, but also says he doesn't care about the truth. All that matters is that the gladiatorial games go smoothly.
No!
Bring me the proof. Then I will propose the release of Vipsanius to Antonius.
I will find the evidence somehow.
Wow, what a villain. After the grueling nightmare that is the late-game stealth sections, Octavianus finds Julius Caesar's notes concerning his successors. A few revelations are unearthed. Firstly, that Antonius was not who Caesar had named as his next successor. In fact, quite the opposite. Julius raked him over the coals. Secondly, we discover the name of the other Brutus, Decius. After a person named Sextus tries to assassinate Octavianus for some reason, Claudia makes the save and tells him to run. We stumble upon a familiar sight with a member of the congregation brutally stabbed, but this time we catch the act as it's happening, Decius dealing the blow. It's here we finally get the full story from Marcus. Decius created the conspirators to take out Caesar to gain power for himself, and took advantage of the Senate members who grew tired of Julius's dictatorship. Marcus gives Octavianus the assassination plot and reveals that Marcus was Caesar's bastard son, but received no love from his father. Apparently everyone already knew about this, which made it even more embarrassing. His hatred over this caused him to join the conspirators, but he couldn't bring himself to kill Caesar. He just wanted his father to love him. After this, Octavianus takes the evidence to Maecenas, but he has him arrested and taken away, as he doesn't want Octavianus to continue to meddle and ruin the upcoming games. And that's the last we'll hear of Octavianus for the time being. Now it's time to travel back in time and unravel Agrippa's side of things. Don't worry, there isn't quite as much going on here. After seeing his dad at the prison and resolving to become a gladiator to hopefully make the rescue, Agrippa goes with Claudia to her brother's training camp. Sextus questions Agrippa, making sure he's prepared for the hardship of being a gladiator, and makes him prove his worth in a tutorial about the salvos and other mechanics. After a final sparring match with Claudia, Agrippa apparently showed his skills enough to satisfy Sextus. Sextus dubs him an official gladiator, a rank lower than the lowest slave. This is his new home, he's unable to leave as a free man. The first real bit of anything resembling the story or character plotlines advancing comes after the Valcross Arcanus fight, where Claudia came to help you for some reason. It does make a difficult encounter a little more manageable, like I said earlier, but it also gives her more screen time and allows for Agrippa to save her from a thrown blade to the back. This makes them even, as she of course rescued him before. Something pretty clever here is that this sequence is a mirror image of what happened earlier with Agrippa's mother, except this time he's able to make the save. The parties even match up. Decius threw the sword that killed Agrippa's mother, and one of Decius's most revered warriors threw the dagger at Claudia. Decius is visibly upset that one of his clan went down to a lowly gladiator, but then recognizes who that gladiator is, and becomes even more enraged. Sextus thanks Agrippa for saving Claudia, and reveals they've only known each other for 10 years, despite them calling each other brother and sister. He gives you a good luck charm, a necklace, to give to Claudia, and Agrippa confidently takes a bite of an apple. You walk across the camp and give it to her, and she reveals part of her backstory. She lost her little brother to a Roman soldier. She wants to become strong to protect those she cares about, which is why she chose to become a gladiator. We then cut to Sextus with a very interesting set of twins. Their shifty eyes, the way they don't move smoothly, really freak me out. Iris and Charmaine are their names. Their mistress wants Sextus to assassinate someone, and we're left in the dark on who that could be for now. The mistress is someone we don't ever encounter in this game, but if you look up Charmaine, the real person that existed, it says she was a servant of Cleopatra of Egypt. Their attire probably gave it away for people more observant than me, but anyway, I'll discuss this Cleopatra stuff a little later. The main thing for now is Sextus agrees to assassinate that unnamed someone, and the twins are who hired him. Next Agrippa section starts with Maecenas meeting Sextus, informing him and us that Antonius will be holding a chariot race. Maybe this was simply done so as to warn players of the chariot race in a diegetic manner, or they wanted to have Maecenas visit Sextus to cross their paths at least once, but either way, it's a mostly uneventful and short scene. The boss of the chariot races opens with a cutscene where Agrippa realizes this man works for Decius too. It's not much, but it keeps Decius in the forefront of our minds. This man is the main antagonizing force for Agrippa, and has been from the start. After Agrippa wins, Decius is furious yet again. Funkmaster General is brought in, and Decius, in a classic villain way, murders him for his failure. It's fun watching these cutscenes back a second time, since I'm able to pick up on some things I missed the first go-around. At this point in the Octavianus story, we don't know who the murderer is yet. We were tailing Maecenas, and we're still suspicious of Marcus. Here, in this boring and, at first blush, fairly run-of-the-mill bad guy murder subordinate scene, we get a first-hand look at how the very murders we've been investigating played out. A stab into the torso with a dagger, something Decius is very familiar with, as his body count is at least Caesar and Cassius at this point. Later on, we overhear an argument between Claudia and Sextus, implying that Claudia now knows the assassination request has been accepted, much to her disapproval, and stomps out. Her shock at seeing Agrippa is pretty convincing. Initially, I thought this meant Agrippa was the one they were referring to, that he's the one Sextus was hired to eventually assassinate. Again, I didn't realize the twins were in Egyptian-like garb, so I figured Decius was doing everything he could to assure Agrippa's demise. Just a fun way my expectations were subverted thanks to the clever ways they hid certain bits of information. For instance, knowing the target's name would clear up my incorrect assumption, but they used Agrippa overhearing the end of a conversation as the reason why the player didn't get the full context, which I assumed was meant to convey that Agrippa was being talked about but didn't realize it. Anyway, afterwards, Sextus wants to be left alone, and Claudia tells more of her backstory. She confirms that Sextus isn't her real brother. She was sold as a slave in Rome, and eventually Sextus bought her. Her suspicion is that he saw his dead sister in her. It's certainly an interesting bit of nuance being presented to us. Her life was worse as a slave under one owner, but after being sold to a better owner, one who raised and took care of her, she ends up being grateful to that person instead of viewing them as a part of a grander problem. Maybe a bit of Stockholm Syndrome at play here, but really, who could blame her? If she genuinely feels like she received a better life and believes Sextus earned her respect, who are we to say otherwise? These are hard times to live in. After Agrippa succeeds in the final qualifying match against Velcros Ascari and his elephant, Sextus's camp celebrates with a party, but Sextus is apparently absent. Agrippa meets with Claudia, and we get a huge revelation. She unveils that Sextus isn't a showman for the games, that's just a front. He's actually a pirate who plans to destroy Rome in an act of vengeance, as he's the son of Pompeius himself, the enemy of Caesar who fell in battle to him, which we learned earlier with the Antonius Estate text blurb. Absolutely wild stuff, but I barely noticed that big reveal, as Agrippa's dialogue and voice acting on the whole in this scene is distractingly bad.
Friend Octavianus.
You are lying. I do not believe that he would do such a thing. Who would do such a thing? Who ordered the assassination? What is going on? It is all so confusing. Ah!
Claudia warns Agrippa that Sextus took on the assassination of Octavianus so as to garner support to overthrow Rome from someone she doesn't know. Claudia asks for help, which Agrippa agrees to, but I don't know, the emotions and faces, even the background music, just seem really off for this scene. Claudia basically asks for help with the reasoning that Sextus wouldn't survive trying to overthrow Rome, which Agrippa just kinda, I don't know, doesn't react much to and agrees. I get that he's confused, but surely the fall of Rome and his friend being assassinated are higher priorities for him? The next scene is very strange, it almost feels out of place. We jump from what we just saw, after a long and rough Octavianus stealth section anyhow, to Agrippa informing Claudia that Sextus is missing. She says Sextus found Octavianus, that she did everything she could to stop him, but he wouldn't listen. She says, don't worry, Octavianus is safe? Again, we've been under the assumption that these timelines are playing out at the same time in chronological order, and Octavianus doesn't get jumped by Sextus's guards until way later, which is when Claudia shows up and tells him to run away. It almost sounds like in this scene she's referring to that moment where she saved him, but she can't be, since at the end of this sequence she says she has to go after Sextus. Very confusing, I don't know what to make of this. The twins make a random appearance for no reason to taunt us and them about the assassination Sextus took on from their mistress. They refer to her as the Great One, but surely they don't mean The Rock, right? Anyway, the music is really cool when they show up. Have a listen. Claudia, it seems, is able to figure out who their mistress is, as she asks why Sextus would help the likes of her. She then storms out to find Sextus, which apparently she didn't do yet, like I said earlier, which is weird. This far into the game, it's worth mentioning real quick how insanely difficult the gladiator battles are getting. I'll touch on the difficulty and the endgame absurdness in a bit, but no, this step up in challenge is present all over in the latter quarter of the game, both for the stealth and the combat sections. Claudia makes the save during Octavianus' assassination attempt like I showed earlier, then Octavianus gets arrested after showing the evidence to Macanus. Here we go, the final round, the culmination of everything we've been working towards, a one-on-one fight with Decius. The dialogue between the two, in addition to the camera angles they went with, make this interaction feel kind of fun, like a sparring of words before an epic battle.
Finally, you will pay for what you did to my Velcros Legion.
Quite a good show, was it not?
Silence!
Do you see these hands? They will tear you apart.
A dog's bark is often worse than his bite.
Speaking of dogs, your mother, she was not too bad. The only regret I have is not having some fun with her before I killed her.
Okay, maybe not all of it is fun.
Shut up!
The cage rises, and good lord is Decius a monster. 5 health bars, apparently? I guess it makes sense, this is the final boss, the thing everything in the story was leading to, so it should feel properly climactic. After managing to remove 2 of his health bars, thankfully the pain is over early, the fight ends. Decius turns the tables, however, tricking Agrippa and raising his sword to slaughter him, but then the cage lowers and guards walk in. Macanus enters and announces the father of Rome, Julius Caesar, has come back! Everyone is stunned, but none more than Antonius. As Caesar greets the crowd, Decius starts losing it and almost blurts out that he's the one who stabbed him, but Macanus beats him to it. He says that was not Julius Caesar who died, but an imposter, that Vipsanius had warned him ahead of time of the plan to assassinate him. This is true, by the way, at least a little, as we find his letter in the evidence room at the start. Decius can't believe it, and Macanus announces to the crowd that Decius is the man behind the assassination attempt, and the murder of the Senate members was also his doing, his way of silencing them forever. Vipsanius is innocent. Agrippa embraces his father. Antonius calls out Macanus, saying there was no doubt it was Caesar. Caesar questions why Antonius is sitting there, saying he doesn't remember naming Antonius as successor. Antonius gets the finger pointed at him for being behind the whole thing, that he was the one who influenced Decius to create the conspirators and to do the deed after finding out he wasn't going to be named as the successor. Macanus says they know everything now. Antonius has a flashback to when he first saw he wasn't the successor, it being the twins' mistress who gave him the information that kickstarted all of this. Antonius won't accept this rubbish. Is that a word people in ancient Rome used? Then Agrippa asks who the real successor to Caesar is. Kinda weird to me that that's what people are concerned with right now when they visibly have the old Julius back, but whatever. Macanus then reveals that the real successor, the one the crowd has already deemed Caesar without even realizing it, is...
This man is the true successor of the late Julius Caesar. Octavianus!
Macanus says everything went smoothly according to his plan. Okay, first of all, how is the audience hearing anything they're saying? Macanus is speaking so softly up there, I swear. Ignoring my attempt at humor, I do have problems with this, but not necessarily because of the sudden shift to him being a good guy. You could argue that it would make sense that the secretary of Antonius came across the letter and forged will, figuring out what happened and putting the pieces together before suggesting the gladiatorial games in the Senate chamber. He was trying to keep his plan on track, and the ridding of the people behind it in the first place, with Decius racking up the body count on his own, could, I guess, be part of his plan too. He did let Octavianus free when he could have arrested him earlier, if you remember, which is nice of him, but here's my issue. If Macanus, at some point, read the document Antonius saw in the flashback like I proposed, and thus that being how he figured out the real story behind Caesar's death, that would mean Macanus knew Octavianus was the true successor as far back as the Senate meeting, which is at the beginning of the game. Why let Octavianus snoop around, endangering himself for the proof that Macanus doesn't need? Think about it. He came out, pretended Caesar was alive again, got the culprits to admit they were behind it, then revealed Octavianus. What I'm saying is, even if that assassination plot scroll of paper Octavianus acquired was somehow important in all of this, it's such a high-risk gamble. Want to know what I mean by that? Sure, here's a supercut. Octavianus is dancing on a knife's edge. The guards will slaughter him on sight. Why even bother with letting him uncover secrets on his own if the true successor could so easily fall victim to the trigger-happy guards or, Decius, a man who's been slaying Senate members left and right? Why did getting caught by Macanus fail the level in the middle of the game? Like, what on earth, man? Just arrest him early on, then let him in on the plan instead of allowing him to fly solo. Everything would have worked the same, if not better, And if the hidden Caesar's will is vital, I mean, it certainly seems like Maecenas is in charge of the guards, so that would be a far easier document to obtain if the guards became a non-factor. If the argument is that Maecenas didn't know Octavianus was risking his life sneaking around, he definitely knew after his strange impression failure thing.
Maecenas!
Finally, and least importantly, Octavianus was able to disguise himself so well here that he became a spitting image of Caesar. So perfect was his likeness to him that it fooled even Antonius and Decius. Absolutely wild. Decius then threatens all of them, saying he'll kill them all. Agrippa says he'll handle this, and they raise the cage up again. I was devastated when this happened. There's no checkpoint granted here. This is the second phase of the fight. Why not send in the guards, Maecenas? No, let Agrippa handle it, sure. Fucking hell, this fight is hard. He can perform a grab attack, which opens you up for so many hits. When his claws break off, they basically serve as daggers, which is kinda cool, but nothing that will carry you through the fight. Getting his nails locked into the statues is fun though, but having to break those statues for the weapons you need is rough since he's so quick. The Romans do throw in some weapons now and then, thankfully, as if they didn't, there's not much we could do. Decius doesn't go into a groggy state from what I can tell, and no goober enemies means no opportunities for racking up the salvos to appeal to the audience. I also noticed that when you do make the appeal, and you hear a, "use this," the weapon takes a lot longer than usual to land on the ground. Maybe the extra distance it needs to travel thanks to the cage is the reason? The big halberd does do the most damage, but you're much slower with it equipped, and he's so fast he can close the distance easily. Even more, he can dodge behind you, which is how I ended up failing this battle. Oh man, I was so upset. 5 health bars in total with a tough enemy is just insanity. After being slain, Decius claims to be a genius, the best general to ever live. I guess it was a true general versus general fight, with Agrippa's prior centurion status, which makes this rivalry even more fitting. Antonius comes down and approaches with a gigantic sword. This made me really worried. I desperately wanted a save, a checkpoint, and then the cage raises, the screen fades to black, and you have to fight Antonius right fucking now. I thankfully didn't die, so I can't say I know for sure, but fucking hell, 3 phases to this fight with no checkpoint? The developers are fucking psychopaths. 4 health bars, but I managed to pull it off thanks to some overuse of the most OP weapon, the spear, since you can keep your distance, attack quickly, and spam it to all hell. All things considered, Antonius needed to be dealt with, so this fight being so climactic and long makes sense. It's what the entire story was leading to, the culmination of your efforts on both sides. Oh, now the guards show up, great. Octavianus, Maecenas, and Vipsanius run in, and they all have a chat to close out the game. Maecenas goes into detail about how he came to the conclusions and formed this plan, which just confirms my complaints from earlier. He was Caesar's secret negotiator, apparently, meaning he was a good guy going even further back, it seems. This was the only way to expose the assassination plot to a wide audience. He's right, I suppose. That makes sense why he wanted the games to go smoothly. However, it doesn't explain him letting Octavianus gamble his life for days on end, or speaking so quietly earlier that no one could hear him. Anyway, Octavianus accepts the role, and Maecenas apologizes for his rude behavior. Agrippa says as long as his father is safe, that's all that matters. Wow, I guess his mother was a bitch then, huh? They embrace and all is well, until... What is happening? Fire arrows storm in from above. Sextus appears with an army. He says they're here for Antonius. Black armored soldiers rush in. All hell is breaking loose. Agrippa rushes to go after Sextus, but an archer is shooting an arrow at him. His father dives in front of it, and no one even bothers to check if the archer is still there shooting or not, but they're all good. Right after the fade to black, it gives you a save prompt. Thank the fucking Lord. From here on out, the gladiatorial games are done with. It's, sadly, time to linearly trek through some mostly unoccupied environments. The enemies here are all fairly easy, which is a relief, and it was kind of fun to fight in city streets and stores, perhaps even the same ones you were in earlier as Octavianus. Everything is burning. Sextus's plans are going far better than you may have suspected. You find Claudia handling herself well against 2 soldiers, and they agree to go after Sextus. Then...
Oh, no, you won't.
I swear, that music is a banger. It's perfect entrance music for building suspense. This one leads to another boss fight. 2-on-2, Zito and Guido, both with 2 health bars. We don't know who these two are, but there are suspicions they could have been the bodyguards of Cleopatra or something. They have spears by default, which makes them kind of tricky. Some of their attacks are a little cheap and have wonky hitboxes, but it's not a huge deal. What's worse, though, is how they, and you, obtain more weapons when they break. When they break their spears, they are vulnerable for attacks right away, which is great, but they have to go behind the curtain, essentially, like a play, to get more props. When you're close to having your weapon break, Claudia does the same thing, which is just a goofy-looking visual, but it also leaves you stranded for a while, and she is dead set on placing the fucking thing right at your feet for some reason. You can use their spear when you kill one of them, which is cool. Afterwards, we see the twins up high, they ask if we're satisfied, and run off. I don't know what that means.
Are you satisfied?
More fighting of regular enemies as you make your way to Sextus's ship. The boxes are what house weapons and food, since you can't ask the non-existent audience, which is fine, I suppose. This will continue in the next few encounters, so we better get used to it. Kinda lame that in these sections you may end up hitting an invisible wall when trying to German suplex fools off the docks. You make your way to Sextus's ship and find him riding down on a rope. Actually, this looks really familiar. Huh. Sextus says Antonius is somewhere on the seas right now, presumably to Egypt, I would guess. He says he couldn't believe Octavianus was friends with Agrippa. Sextus explains that his father's dying wish was to take over Rome, and he's not going to stop now. Claudia protests, and she gets a bam zoom straight to the moon. Agrippa says fate brought them to this moment. From the very beginning, they were meant to fight here. Another final boss fight coming up, this time with 4 health bars. I suppose this being the climactic end battle makes sense. It's the culmination of everything in the game, where everything was leading to, so it being drawn out and difficult makes for a grand finale. You'll be hunting for items and boxes the whole fight. Sextus, much like Decius and Antonius previously, block any attack you throw their way if they aren't in an obvious punishment state. It is kind of weird that you can use the quicksand move here on this dock, but what can I say, it came in handy. After you get used to his combos, blocking all of his hits before dealing damage yourself, it's not so bad. However, I did die here one time thanks to me getting anxious and panicky near the end. Even though it sucked, I did manage to see that they gave the player a checkpoint right at this boss fight though, so maybe this is what would have happened in the Antonius fight too? I don't know, but I sure hope so. After you defeat him, Claudia wakes up and rushes over. Agrippa begs Sextus to surrender. Fireballs start raining in. Sextus assumes this is Antonius' doing, that he has no use for him anymore. Sextus pushes Claudia away as a building is about to topple over and crush them, then a flashback, the interaction of Sextus meeting Claudia for the first time. Claudia was a name given to her by Sextus, it was his dead sister's name. Sad music plays, and Claudia mourns her brother's sacrifice. Then, the game keeps going. In epic naval battle, Octavianus looks to be in charge, leading the efforts. Agrippa makes way for Antonius' ship. More fights with goober enemies here, some made kinda goofy as they can at times walk through the fire that was supposed to make you redirect your path, but come away unharmed. I'll at least say that walking over the bridges used to access each new ship felt kind of cool. I get cheesed by an enemy who warps over to stab me yet again as I try to utilize the quicksand move. Finally, we're here. Antonius stands in front of a burning backdrop, giant golden sword in hand. If I showed you just this one clip, you'd probably correctly guess that this is a Japanese game. Another Japanese game trope, the never-ending series of final bosses, has finally hit its true climax. I know I was being silly earlier, saying everything was leading to this fight, and then this fight, and so on, but that's really how it felt. I could have easily seen, and maybe been happy, the game end after Decius and Antonius at the arena. I could have seen it end after Sextus, making our pursuit of Antonius to Egypt be in the long-lost sequel to this game. But no, a brutally hard 2-phase 5 health bar Decius fight, leading right into a challenging 4 health bar Antonius fight without a break. Then practically a 2-on-1 boss battle with some weird foreign foes, a destined meeting between Gladiator and Owner with Sextus, which, in a way, also represents Julius Caesar facing Pompeius one last time. Finally, the naval battle leading to the true end boss, Antonius, with 6 health bars and a lot of cheese up his sleeve. Was I pretty tired of the game by the end? Maybe. The fatigue started to set in during some of the grueling Octavianist stealth sections and a few of the outrageously challenging and time-consuming and gladiatorial battles, if I'm honest. But really, this is such a grand way to end the game. In the moment, yeah, this fight was tough as nails. It took me around 40 minutes or so to finally finish it, dying multiple times. For me at least, it's always hard to judge how I feel about a certain boss when I'm in the thick of it, and even directly afterwards. The same goes for challenging but potentially tedious bits of gameplay found elsewhere. I'm human, and I know how emotional I can sometimes get when I'm a bit frustrated. Not emotional in the I'm gonna break something sense, but just viewing what I'm experiencing more negatively because of my frustrations. While I was in some of these fights, I raised my voice, calling Antonius, Decius, and Sextus little fucking bitches and other swear words. I was cursing the developers, thinking and saying, why on earth is this game still going? But once it's done, and I can now see the entire game as one piece of art, it becomes easier for me to appreciate the full picture. I still think the overall length is a bit too long. I'd prefer one fewer battle in each arena, maybe 2 for the final location, and remove a stealth section or 2 at the very least. It took a long time to get here, which made it feel a bit more exhausting than it should have, but the anime-level boss fights themselves feel very earned. The game does such a good job of presenting the major players initially, building up their characters over time, then following through with their arcs that I just overall was impressed with how seamless and non-gamey these boss fights were. The combat is very gamey, don't get me wrong, I just mean they all felt natural. They aren't simply a random big ogre, or, more applicable for this game, a tough war general to pad the boss list. Even the war general in the tutorial, Barca, had a reason to be there, as his arc was necessary to drive home the only real moment of frustration we see Agrippa let out thanks to the Roman crowds. The 2-on-2 with Claudia is the only one that felt kind of strange, but that was supposed to lead into the sequel we never got, so it isn't that odd when you take that into account. Everybody else during the final act are fleshed out characters that were built up to be opponents from the very start. It's excellent in that way, and really, how could you say no to a final fight with a difficult enemy on a flaming warship? If he was a pushover, it might have felt underwhelming, so even though the 6 health bars is absurd, it at least guarantees that this battle, and thus this setting, will be on screen for a long enough time for most players to hopefully appreciate. Antonius leaves no room for error here. Outlasting him means getting hit is something you cannot afford. There's not much health here, the food in the boxes don't come back. He moves abruptly and quickly. The best strategy for me was to really learn his moveset, making sure to sidestep, not sluggishly walk to the side, when he would do his forward lunge, and punish him with a super attack if I could. Many times my inputs wouldn't read correctly, however, and Agrippa would do a normal swing. This is the best example I have of the unresponsive nature of the controls. Really, if you want to see how bad the controls are for any game, put in a difficult enemy, one with little room for error, and see if the players die or make mistakes by fudging the inputs enough times. He blocks your attacks after your first hit. The only exception seems to be the flail swings, meaning charge up or super attacks are the only way to deal considerable amount of damage with most weapons. An errant swing after you've successfully baited and dodged the right attack genuinely could be the reason you have to start over, and it was for me on a few occasions. Near his final health bars, he turns red no matter what. He does a taunt and charges up, but even if you interrupt it, he still turns Super Saiyan God. He's a lot faster here and more aggressive, which is just swell. Overall, though, I did come away with an appreciation for this fight. It took a while, I had to learn this boss like it was a difficult Sekiro encounter, but I think it was worth it in the end. Octavianus joins Agrippa on the ship, and Antonius proclaims his spirit will live on in Rome. As he makes his final speech, he backs further and further away, until he falls overboard. A close-up of his sword, and fade to black. When their ship returns, we see that Agrippa's father is alive next to Macanus. After another fade to black, we see Claudia at Sextus's grave. Claudia says she's leaving, but will be watching from afar. As she walks away, Agrippa calls out, asking her to promise to return to Rome. Another last-second smirk, and she leaves without saying a word. Octavianus then says he will fulfill Caesar's dream of the Pax Romana, whatever it takes. While this is a nobler pursuit than the destruction of Rome, I mean maybe, depending on your point of view, they did have slavery and gladiator fights after all, This really isn't all that dissimilar from the trap that Sextus fell into. He was living his life based on his father's dream, and it led to a lot of death and suffering, and the game certainly points to the overthrow of Rome as a negative. To then paint Octavianus's goal as a positive is certainly interesting. After a mostly epic credits roll, thanks to the grandiose music, we get a small teaser.
We must tell the Great One that we have reached the end of the beginning.
The end of the beginning. Well, it's finally time to let the cat out of the bag. This development team at Capcom wanted to make a Shadow of Rome 2. It would have likely involved Egypt and Cleopatra, a direct follow-up. However, although it was a critical success, the sales weren't what they hoped. This was aimed at a Western audience, and they decided it wasn't worth it to make a sequel, so while they were in production of Shadow of Rome 2, they switched to making a different game instead. That game being Dead Rising. Yes, now it all makes sense, doesn't it? The German suplex, the throwable items, the breakable weapons, the food that replenishes health, the psychopathic and sometimes sympathetic boss fights, Sextus being a mirror image of Carlito, Antonius finishing himself off at the end, the battle axes and katanas found in the Willamette Mall. It's all so fantastic. For real though, all of this is genuinely tough to come to grips with. On one hand, Shadow of Rome is good enough that it definitely deserved a sequel. On the other, would I trade Dead Rising for that sequel? No, I wouldn't. It sucks that this game sold poorly either way, though. If I had to guess, it was a mix of it looking more generic than it turned out to be, and the many other ancient Roman and Greek games that came out that year already. There likely wasn't that much interest in this setting anyway, and all the players that wanted it likely went with God of War and felt content with that. It being locked to the PS2 might not have helped, but then again, God of War was too, and that did fine. It even got a remaster collection on the PS3, which is certainly nice. In my opinion, Shadow of Rome absolutely deserves something akin to a remaster as well. I have no doubt many would enjoy this game, especially the hardcore Dead Rising fans, since this is such an obvious precursor to the first game. Sadly, if you want to play this officially, you better have a PS2. You can enter a New Game Plus mode after the game has been completed once, which, from the looks of it, just keeps your salvo list. I think it would have been better to reveal the ones you're missing so you can hunt them down easier, but oh well. You can relive all of the gladiator battles that took place in the story at the main menu. It essentially teleports you into that moment of the campaign as Sextus is there, and they may talk of things relating to the arena like you saw in the story. You can strive to get better rankings, bronze, silver, and gold. There are a host of unlockable cheats in Shadow of Rome, all of which seem to relate to the rankings of the fights. However, something I realized while looking up to unlock them was that many of the better ones are locked behind getting all bronze, silver, gold, and etc. for hard difficulty, which you can't access in the main menu until you beat the hard mode campaign, which would mean having to do all the stealth sections too. Even more, there's extreme difficulty, which gates even more of the game's cheats behind. Like, seriously, this is asking a lot. For me, on normal I thought the game was pretty difficult near the end, and I barely scraped by with bronze and silvers. The thought of achieving gold on all normal levels sounds brutal, but 2 more difficulty levels afterwards? Hell nah, that's ludicrous. I get not wanting players to use unbreakable weapon and infinite health cheats to skate by on extreme, I guess, but locking them behind becoming a master of the game just makes no sense to me. I would have made the unlock difficulty level specific. Get silver on all normal battles, you can now use the unbreakable weapon cheat on normal difficulty, yay! I don't know, it just seems wild that to have fun with these cheats, you basically have to run the game into the ground becoming a god at it, and then at that point, what's the purpose anymore? You've done everything you possibly could do. Speaking of doing everything you could possibly do, I think that's all there is to say on Shadow of Rome. I'll save you from the now predictable and tired speech about how this video is longer than I thought it was going to be and all that. What's important is the game. Shadow of Rome is mostly awesome as all hell. Strictly looking at Agrippa's half of the game, what could have been mostly samey gladiator bouts always felt fresh thanks to the multitude of traps, gimmicks, objectives, enemy types, weapons, and salvos to earn. With the setting being mostly an open arena for every fight, somehow they got out of that all they possibly could, offering a truckload of gameplay possibilities for the player to goof around with. Octavianus' stealth half was mostly great as well, it just overstayed its welcome near the end, not really offering anything substantially new, just increasing the challenge by adding in more enemies. Even still, the ways in which you can approach each new situation was a fun time, and being able to explore Rome with him, even buying things for your room, was so cool. This is such a fun game. I had a blast with it. I'm happy I stuck through that opening hour. If you have an interest in this setting, and find yourself an opportunity to play Shadow of Rome, I'd highly encourage it. It would be all the better if you, say, loved and appreciated Dead Rising's gameplay as well, which, wouldn't you know it, fits the bill for me and a lot of my audience. How funny is that? Thanks for watching to the end. I have a Patreon, some lovely supporters of which should be on screen right about now, but I also set up a Ko-Fi link as well for one-time donations. Ko-Fi, coffee, who cares? If you see value in these videos enough to throw a few bucks my way, that's awesome. I've been streaming more lately too, right here on YouTube, so stop by and say hi. YouTube has now split its video and live sections on the channel page, which means I don't have to feel guilty about leaving the stream VODs up on the channel. I recently did a full Dead Rising 3 playthrough and played through its DLC. It was quite the experience. That's it for me. I hope to see you next time. Have a good one.
Are you